We need to dig much deeper into what all of this means. Yamiche Alcindor, White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. My friend Tim O'Brien, Trump biographer and executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion. David Jolly, former Republican congressman from the state of Florida. And Philippe Reines, who was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under Hillary Clinton. And he's now co-host of the podcast Unredacted. Yamiche, I must turn to you because you were at the White House yesterday. I want to ask about the president calling people who disagree with him, who are very critical of him, anti-American, and that they should leave the country. Is that fundamentally different than the president who regularly calls his opponents names?
I think this was fundamentally different because what the president was doing was picking out these 4 women of color who have immigrant backgrounds, one of which was born in Somalia, but the 3 of which were born in the United States, and saying these people should go back to their countries. And essentially he was saying that they're not Americans to begin with. The White House is pushing back on that, saying, well, what he really meant was everybody who disagrees with him should leave the country. And that includes, quote, Hollywood liberals, making a slight reference to people who said they were going to move to Canada if the president was elected. But I think this is essentially different. There are times where the president has had policy differences with Democrats, saying that they want open borders. But in this case, he's literally calling these women anti-American and saying that they're pro-terrorism, which is just patently false and patently racist. So I think that this is a different time. This is a time that I think is going to go down in history as a low point for this administration. The president is essentially juxtaposing what he thinks are good Americans, which are mostly white supporters of his, with these women who are women of color.
Or will he, Congressman? We've said this is a low point over and over. You could go back to birtherism. Is it actually different this time, or will the president achieve his goal of painting the Democratic Party as far left with these 4 women who haven't even been in office for a year as the face of leadership of the party? No mention of Nancy Pelosi, who's been in the job since 1987.
Every Republican political consultant was already there. These 4 individuals will be the face of the party in 2020. They will be tied to the Democratic nominee and every Democratic congressional candidate. They are the new Nancy Pelosi in terms of the Republican boogeyman.
If Democrats allow that to be the case.
Well, no, not in real politics. You can print mailers as a Republican without permission of Democrats. They're going to do this because the polls say that this will work. But understand, Stephanie, what's happening here, and it should be heartbreaking that we're actually seeing this evolve. The president has pivoted to a message that is more acceptable among Americans just in 24 hours. And what I mean by that is what was racist in his Sunday statement was when he said, go back to where you came from. That was the racist thing when he singled out 4 women of color.
3 of the 4 were born in the United States.
I know, but this reflects the fact that Donald Trump believes American citizenship is uniquely a white privilege, if you will. He said, go back to where you came from. By Monday and now today, it's if you hate America, then leave. Okay, that's not a fully new message, and frankly, that's a very populist message. If you don't like it here, leave. There's still enormous things wrong with that message, but he has already stepped away from what was the racist core of his Sunday message. It is hard to focus on that because we don't want to, because it's heartbreaking. You know, we suffer the outrage cycle. It should be heartbreaking that the President of the United States suggests that if you are a person of color who dissents, and in his mind they were an immigrant, it doesn't matter that factually that's not true. In his mind, they were an immigrant, and he was saying to people of color in the immigrant community, you're not allowed to stay in the United States if you dissent. What I appreciate about what AOC just did in her tweet, she focused in on the fact that he said, immigrants may not dissent with political leaders in the United States, or you have to go back to where you came from.
Okay, then put your political strategist hat on for me. The president wants to run, he is running for re-election. If the most important things to voters are health care, education, the economy, what in the world does any of this have to do with the legislative agenda?
It has nothing to do with it.
But that works?
I don't know. I'd make a counter argument that they tried this exact same play in 2018, making Nancy Pelosi the boogeyman. There's always a boogeyman. Yet we're in the majority in the House right now because it didn't work. For every person that looks at those 4 young women, freshman congresswomen, and says, ugh, I don't like this, they're not voting for anyone other than Trump. They're the reason why Trump is in office. There are a lot of people who look at that and find them inspirational. Now, I don't agree with them legislatively, but you know what? He's picking a fight with 4 people that know how to fight back. He is lucky as hell that AOC is not 35 years old yet, because that woman knows how to slay everyone that comes her way. And, you know,
Why? So what happens when she's 35?
35, I think we'd be sitting here having a roundtable about, you know,
How she poll in New
how'd she
Hampshire.
poll, and you know, but you know, there's
go.
a thing about you're asking about the low point. There is no bottom we haven't touched yet, but there is a problem in that, and you're active on Twitter. One of the more annoying things I ever read is if you're surprised by this, then you haven't been paying attention. You know what? I've been paying a lot of attention, and yesterday was more problematic than usual because we all know the infamous "I can stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone," and it's turning out to be pretty true. But he's feeling his oats. Even he, I think, is seeing that there is no limit. And he's one step away from saying, I can drive a tank down Fifth Avenue. And, you know, it's very different. When he made his Charlottesville comments, the White House said that's not what he means, and read the transcript. There wasn't a whole lot of that yesterday. If you watch Republicans, they were saying he was joking, that's not what he meant. Donald Trump himself said that is what I meant. And to be a total Debbie Downer, to go one step further than the congressman, is he's one step away from saying, you know what, if they don't want to be here, they shouldn't be here, and maybe we should get rid of him. I'm going to take a look at that. I mean, this is where he's headed.
Tim, in your latest article, you write this: Trump and his most dedicated supporters have ripped the Band-Aid off whatever reassuring notions the United States might have had about the progress of civil rights and the withering of racism in this country. Now, the president's allies have said he's just frustrated with Congress right now, that this is somehow all about politics. What do you say to this?
Well, I don't think we should ever rely on Trump's allies to interpret what Trump thinks or says, because most of them don't really know. Trump's closest aides don't really know because he's a loose cannon. I do think he is trying, which is what he's done from the beginning of his presidency, is to foster this notion of the other. There's always this outside threat, and I will be the final bulwark against these people of color or these women or the terrorists coming through Central America to cross the southern border. I will get in the way of all of this for you. He did it before the midterms. And I think, referring to what you said before, it's important to remember that even though he did that during the midterms with the caravans, he suffered a devastating loss in the midterms. Donald Trump is a racist and a bigot. He is not someone. He is not someone playing three-dimensional.
Would you have said that before he won the election?
You know, I would have said before he won the election that he was someone who pandered to race. I wasn't sure prior to the election how profoundly racist he was based on my past experience with him. Donald Trump historically has associated with a lot of people of color, but only people of color in his business life. Celebrities, athletes, the Mike Tysons and Don Kings of the world, Russell Simmons. He had members of hip-hop groups at Mar-a-Lago as guests, much to the distaste of Palm Beach society. He was willing to sort of throw that in their face, but he wasn't having average people of color. Working people of color were never part of his life. He went out of his way for people of color because they were useful to his wallet. He never went out of his way for people of color on policy decisions. He's now president of the United States. He's not a private businessman. And he owes it to the country as a leader to say the right things about race. And it's not an accident that he's not. And it's not an accident for 2 reasons. One is because he's a bigot. He's Don from Queens who's calling into the radio show, and he's irked that his neighborhood in Jamaica is integrating. That's who he is. That's where he comes from. The second thing is he lacks the moral and intellectual character to step up in this moment and define the difference between conservatism and liberalism as something other than race.
Yamiche, I want to share what House Republican Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, an ardent supporter, obviously, of the president, had to say.
The president is not a racist. I think this is really coming down to a battle about ideology. No disrespect in any shape or form. There are some people on the other side of the aisle that call themselves the socialist Democrats, and I think it's a philosophy that people have a difference of opinion.
Okay, the president was not talking about democratic socialism. If he was, Bernie Sanders would have been his target. But what does this do to the president's strategy if, let's say, Joe Biden, the current frontrunner, becomes his opponent? Yesterday, while the president was launching attacks on these 4 women, Joe Biden rolled out his health care plan, which is not Medicare for all. It's Obama 2.0. If that's the case, how can the president win on this doubling down of those who are un-American socialists?
Well, I think Kevin McCarthy's talking about this idea of ideology, but the president didn't win the election because he had a bunch of great policies. He won the election because he ignited people to really think about the future of America, to think about their own identity, and to feel as though he was the person who could carry the torch forward. So I think what the president is going to continue to double down on is this idea that the other side is trying to destroy your way of life. That's what he's been saying in rallies. That's what he's going to continue to say. I will say that the White House yesterday was trying to pivot, and we've seen this before. Yesterday, when the president was talking about these four congresswomen, the White House told me, and White House officials told me, well, he was really just telling them to leave the country. He wasn't saying that they should go back to their countries. That's a big difference, as people have pointed out, but it's a difference that Philip mentioning the White House wasn't doing that.
It's also not what he said.
It's not what he said. What they're doing there is not. They realize that this is not a defensible thing that they can say. This is something that we want to defend. It's an indefensible statement. I'll say that was very true also with child separation. They weren't trying to, at some point, defend separating children. They were then starting to say, oh, actually, Obama did this. So what we see is the president realizes with this issue on telling congresswomen to go back to their country when they were born in the United States, and with child separation, where children were being ripped out of their mother's arms, these are indefensible things that he doesn't even want to defend. So what we're going to see him do is continue to pivot and continue to say that he meant something different when he obviously didn't.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.